You're listening to The Murder in My Family, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its host, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss the murder in your family on this podcast, please be sure to visit themurderinmyfamily.com for more information. You can support this podcast by visiting patreon.com/themurderinmyfamily. This episode may contain unsettling material or subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Murder in My Family. I'm your host, Mike Morford. In this episode, we'll be discussing the violent murder of a 20-year-old wife and mother who died on the floor of her own apartment. To many, it's not a mystery who's responsible for her death, but 30 years after the fact, the case remains unsolved. We'll dive into this case after some quick housekeeping. Independent podcasts like this one depend on word of mouth to bring in new listeners. So if you find that you enjoy this show, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to your podcast. And be sure to introduce a friend to the show and invite them to listen. With your help, The Murder in My Family can continue to grow and reach a new audience. To learn more about the show or the cases we discuss, please visit themurderinmyfamily.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @MurderMyFam or on Facebook at facebook.com/TMIMF podcast. If you'd like to support this show through a Patreon donation, it's always appreciated, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com/themurderinmyfamily. Benefits of supporting the show on Patreon may include early access to ad-free episodes of the show, plus bonus content not heard in regular episodes. Support may also include thank you cards, stickers, and more. In each episode, I'll give shout-outs to any new supporters. And thank you to all of the supporters that generously donate to help keep the show growing and improving. One last note, please support any of the sponsors that you hear on The Murder in My Family, the way that those sponsors support the show. It's with our sponsor support that this show can go on and continue to provide a platform to share these stories with you in every episode. Thank you. And now on with the show. Kristie Lynn Gunderson Lee was born on September 4th, 1973, to Ellis Gunderson and Barbara McCory. She had an older sister, Diane. Kristie attended Westwood High School, graduating in 1991. While there, she studied cosmetology and was a member of VICA, which stands for Vocational Industrial Clubs of America. Kristie knew she wanted to be a cosmetologist, and after high school started cosmetology school, eventually becoming a licensed cosmetologist. Kristie enjoyed the social aspect of her job, getting to meet and talk with a lot of people. She stood out due to her 5'1", 92-pound frame and teased-up blonde hair, and her bubbly personality. It was while in high school that Kristie met and began dating Jeffrey Lee. Jeff was about 8 years older than Kristie, and while the age gap didn't sit well with Kristie's parents, they figured that embracing the relationship would allow it to be out in the open, instead of Kristie sneaking around with Jeff, and perhaps running off with him. But by his own admission, Jeff was no saint. He had a checkered past which involved drugs and some shady friends. But Jeff told people that meeting Kristie was the best thing that could have happened to him, and that she helped him steer clear of trouble and to be a better person. By 1992, Kristie and Jeff were expecting a son, who they named Zach, and on March 6, 1993, Kristie and Jeff were married. Wanting the best life for their young family, and in an effort to keep Jeff away from some of the temptations of his old life, the couple decided to take Zachary and move with him to Pompano Beach, Florida, where they would live with Jeff's mother and stepfather, Kay and Joe Petralia. Jeff took a job as a travel agent, and Kristie worked at a beauty salon. While Kristie and Jeff worked, Kay and Joe helped take care of Zach. But it soon became evident that Kristie was butting heads with Kay, and often found herself arguing with her over how to best raise her son. Sometimes the arguments became heated, and at one point, Jeff reportedly had to step in between Kristie and Kay to break up a physical altercation. The living arrangements and friction between Kristie and her in-laws was too much, so she and Jeff moved out, taking Zach, and they got their own apartment in Pompano Beach. They hoped that the space between them would cool things off, but they still allowed Kay and Joe to watch Zach while they worked. On March 31st, 1994, tragedy struck. Kay and Joe claimed that they went to Kristie and Jeff's apartment to pick up Zach for the day, arriving at about 8:30 a.m. Jeff had already left for work. Witnesses verified that they saw Kristie greet Kay and Joe when they got there. A different neighbor claimed to have seen the Petralias knock, and Kristie let them into the apartment at 9:20 a.m., almost an hour later. Sometime between 8:30 and 9, Jeff received a page on his pager from his home phone number, but when he called back, no one answered. At 9 a.m., two women who lived in the apartment next to Kristie and Jeff's heard a loud scream. The women noted the time because they were both late for work. When they heard the scream, they weren't alarmed because they had heard Kristie and Jeff argue loudly before and assumed that's what they were hearing. According to Kay and Joe Petralia, they left the apartment at 9:30, taking Zach with them. They planned to go to Walmart to buy him an Easter outfit. They claimed that once they got to the store, they realized that they had left their money at home, so they went back to their own apartment to get the money. And they claimed that while they were there, Zach spilled a drink all over himself. So they decided they needed to go back to Kristie and Jeff's apartment to get clean clothes for Zach, arriving there at 10:20 a.m. They claimed that when they knocked, Kristie didn't answer, and they used their own key to let themselves into the apartment. Once inside, they immediately saw blood on the floor and began calling out to Kristie. Kay claimed that when she went into Kristie's bedroom, she found her daughter-in-law on the floor unresponsive. According to her, she tried to perform CPR and then called 911. First responders and police arrived and determined that 20-year-old Kristie Gunderson Lee was dead, laying in a pool of her own blood. It appeared that Kristie had been attacked in the living room, as blood and one of her fingernails was found in that room. Kristie had been struck twice in the head with something heavy and sharp, and then apparently tried to make her way down the hallway to her bedroom, maybe to shut and lock the door behind her. But her killer caught up to her. She was strangled on the floor next to her bed. There was no sign of a sexual assault. Drawers had been pulled out of the dresser, but nothing was missing. Jewelry, a television, a VCR, and expensive binoculars were still in the apartment, undisturbed, out in plain sight. The front door had been locked, but the sliding glass patio door was unlocked. It was clear to police that someone wanted the murder to look like a burglary gone wrong, but it was clear no burglary had occurred. It seemed to police that Kristie's murder was really a crime of passion. They drove to Jeff's travel agency office in Fort Lauderdale, 20 minutes away from his apartment in Pompano Beach. Jeff was shocked when police told him that Kristie was dead. But in addition to giving Jeff the news, they wanted to see how he responded to it. They felt that he might be responsible for the murder. But it turned out, Jeff had an ironclad alibi. He had been at the office during the time of the murder and hadn't left, and multiple co-workers backed this up. Police determined that there was no way Jeff had murdered his wife. Investigators tried to verify the timeline of events that morning. Some things didn't make sense. They had witnesses that claimed that Kay and Joe Petralia arrived at 8:30 a.m., and they saw Kristie greet them. But another witness said they saw Kristie greet them at 9:20. And then there were the ear witnesses who heard a scream at what they were sure was 9 a.m. Something was off in the timeline, but one thing seemed sure, and that was that investigators didn't believe the Petralia's story. Kay became the main suspect, but there was no way to prove that she was involved. Of course, her fingerprints would be found in the home, as would her DNA. She regularly visited the apartment and babysat Zach. Following the murder, Diane Luzzy, a friend of Kristie's who worked with her at the hair salon, recalled to police Kristie's words just 2 weeks before her murder. Kristie told Diane that if anything happened to her, she didn't want Kay to raise her son. At the time she said that, it seemed odd that Kristie, who was normally upbeat, would think of such things, but in hindsight, it seemed alarming. Other potential suspects were looked at in Kristie's murder, including men who had shown their affection to her at her job at the hair salon. and some of these men were interviewed. But no other good suspects emerged, and police kept coming back to Kristie's in-laws, the Petralias. Soon, even Jeff Lee began to suspect that his mother and stepfather knew more than they were saying, or were involved in Kristie's murder. After Kristie's murder, the Petralias, Jeff, and Zach all moved from Florida back to Texas. Jeff moved in with Kristie's parents, leaving his parents to fend for themselves in a state that they reportedly hated. Kay Petralia then claimed to CPS officials that Jeff had been using cocaine on the drive from Pompano Beach back to Austin, Texas, and had kicked her and Joe out of the car on the way, claiming that he drove with Zach to Texas alone and intoxicated. But CPS didn't buy the claims. In December 1994, Pompano Beach detective Mark Westman showed up at the Petralia's home in Austin, Texas, asking Kay and Joe to take a polygraph test. He felt that their reaction would prove whether they were truly innocent, and that he might need to move on to other suspects. But when he confronted them, Kay began sobbing and insisting she was innocent, and Joe demanded an attorney. In the end, they would not submit to a polygraph test, leaving police more suspicious of them. And it seemed to solidify in Jeff's mind that they were involved in Kristie's death. He eventually cut off ties with his parents. On March 31st, 1995, a tribute to Kristie from her husband and son appeared in the newspaper. It read, "As long as there is time, as long as there is love, as long as I have breath to speak your name, I will love you, because you mean the world to me. We love you, Jeffrey and Zachary Lee." Then on the same date, 1999, another tribute ran, which read, "5 years ago, we had to say goodbye to you. You are in our hearts, where love lives. You are in our dreams, where you communicate with us. And you are in our prayers, where we ask for happiness for you. Our love for you will never die. We love you, Mom, Pat, Zachary, Carla, and Jeff." It seems that Jeff lost his way without Kristie in his life and fell back into old habits. He was arrested on charges of brokering a deal involving a kilo of cocaine and ended up serving time after he failed a drug test while he was out on bond and in a rehab program. Thankfully, Kristie's mother got temporary custody of Zach, and he's now an adult in his early 30s. At some point, the Petralias separated. Kay moved to New York and then later Bahrain, and Joe moved to his parents' home in Victorville, California. According to a 2008 post on an outdated website put together by Emily Dorset, a very close friend of Kristie's, who's our guest in this episode, the Petralias got back together following their separation, and have had at least one encounter with police for domestic violence. Joe Petralia passed away in 2009, and Kay is still alive in her late 70s, living in Texas. It's been 29 years since Kristie Gunderson Lee died a violent death in her apartment, and to date, no one's been charged in her murder. In 2004, DNA in the case was retested, but results were inconclusive. The Petralias, the prime suspects in the case, chose not to cooperate with the investigation. In 1997, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries ran a memorable segment about Kristie's case, which unfortunately didn't lead to any arrest. If you have any information about the murder of Kristie Gunderson Lee, you can contact the Broward County Crime Stoppers at 954-493-TIPS or go to browardcrimestoppers.org. Kristie's close friend, Emily Dorset, has never stopped advocating for Kristie. She doesn't want the case forgotten. She runs a Facebook page for Kristie's case, which you can visit by going to facebook.com/justiceforkristielee. I sat down to discuss Kristie's case with Emily and her efforts to not let her friend be forgotten. We talked about how losing Kristie affected her and Kristie's family, and about the frustration of not seeing justice done after 3 decades. That conversation is coming up in just a moment. Hi, Emily, and welcome to the Murder of My Family. I want to thank you for coming on to discuss your friend Kristie's case with us.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here, and I appreciate the insights that you can bring. You've really taken up the cause to get your friend's story out there and keep her name out there in the spotlight. You've done a lot of advocating for the case. Why was it so important for you to do and still continue to do all these years later?
Well, I have known Kristie since she was 9 years old. her sister and I became friends, I think, around 7th grade. And Kristie was 3 years younger than us. So I kind of took on an older sister type of relationship with her. And when she was killed, I felt like I needed to continue that and help in whatever way I could to get some answers on what happened that day.
Okay. And unfortunately, as we're going to get into, there's still some answers that aren't, fully known, and the case isn't resolved, but we'll definitely get to that. Before we get into what happened, the background of the case, can you tell us a little bit about Kristie herself and some of your memories of her and what she was like?
Yeah, well, like I said, she was 9 years old when I met her. So she was that bratty little sister, when me and her sister, would try to hang out, we thought we were cool at 12 or 13. And she was that bratty little sister that would bother us. I always remember Kristie could burp the alphabet. She was so proud of that for some reason. And she was just this little, small, tiny little girl. She was only like 5 feet, 5'1". She was very tiny, but she had this amazing, beautiful smile. That was the one thing I always remembered about her. She had, and that's actually on her gravestone now. It's your smile is like sunshine, because that's what we used to say. It used to brighten up the room. And but she was as she got older, she didn't let anybody pick on her or anything like that. Even though she was really tiny, she was just this sweet young woman, but yet she was tough still. And and unfortunately, she didn't have many years to do that. But in her 20 years on this earth, she was just a very positive, beautiful young woman. I don't honestly, she never had an enemy. She was just sweet. Everybody liked her.
So it must have been shocking eventually when she did die in such a violent manner.
Yes, it was very shocking.
So, eventually she starts the relationship with her future husband, Jeff Lee, in Texas. They get married. By his own admission, he had a checkered past having to do with drugs, but he had said that Kristie really helped straighten him out. What were your impressions of Jeff and their relationship overall, as far as what you knew of them?
Well, she started dating him at 14, and he was 9 years older than she was. So this was a shock to all of us. Even me at 17, I was shocked at the age difference. And her sister and I did not approve of it because, she was only 14. I mean, I don't think things like that could happen nowadays, for sure. But we didn't approve of it. We thought he was a little controlling because he was older. I mean, he was 23, 24. Her mom admitted to me later on in the years that she knew she made a mistake of allowing the relationship to happen, but she felt that if she put her foot down and said they couldn't see each other, that Kristie would run away with him. So that's why she overall approved of the relationship. He was controlling a bit. I remember, being with her one day at the house, and this is when he went to jail for about 9 months, I think, after they started dating, for some old warrants or something. And I remember she told me that he told her that he had friends driving by the house to make sure, she wasn't having any boys over there or anything. And remember, she's only 14. So I remember telling her, Kristie, he's too old. You can't, too controlling. But she kept with him. And, hindsight is 20/20. But yeah, we didn't approve of it, for sure. But, overall, I became friends with him. But yeah, it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Well, I guess anytime you have a relationship of someone that's still a young teen with an adult man, it's definitely something that's going to, be cause for concern or attention. Yeah. But somehow the relationship did survive. They did get married in 1993. They went on to have a son, Zachary. How did the relationship seem to evolve once they were married and they had Zachary?
Honestly, it wasn't good. I think Kristie just wanted to have that family for Zach. I mean, being a mother was everything to her. I mean, she was so young, she was just so young. And I think she just kind of had that fairy tale that, you know, being married and having the family would be the answer to everything, but it wasn't well. She had a lot of problems with the in-laws, and the whole reason why they moved to Florida was to get away from the drugs in Texas, but it just seemed to follow them even in Florida.
So you mentioned moving to Florida. A lot of times, you know, friendships, if you're back in Texas, I still assume at this time, you know, obviously she's starting a family, she moves to Florida, you know, were you able to stay in the kind of touch that you were used to staying in? Were you able to keep up with what was going on?
Yeah, my son, Zach was born in 1992, and my son was born in 1993. So we kind of connected on that. We were new moms together, as she said, and she would send me these big boxes of used baby clothes, you know, that Zach had grown out of, and she would write me. She would call me. She was calling me about probably once a week or so at that time, before all this happened. So yeah, we always maintained a closeness. She, you know, when she told me that they were going to move back to Texas, she called me and said, hey, you know, help me find an apartment. Can you drive around and look at some places? So yeah, she said we were going to be moms together. That's what she said. So yeah, we were close.
Okay. So they were down in Florida and they were planning on coming back to Texas. That was the plan.
Yes.
Okay. But you know, she didn't get that chance.
No.
How soon before she was supposed to come back, and was she coming back with Jeff too? Was she planning on coming back together? Okay. And how long before they were supposed to come back was it that she was killed?
I think it was about a month or so before her death.
Okay. Did she confide, you know, one of the things that came out was sort of that she was at odds with Jeff's parents frequently and had disagreements and friction with them. Can you describe some of the things that she would tell you, or some of the things she talked about having issues with them with?
The only thing I can remember, and because I think she kept, it was after her death that I found out something from Jeff, but that was one of probably the second to last conversation, or I won't say second to last, but it was within the last month or two before her death. She had called me, and by this time I knew that they were planning on coming back down to Texas. And she said something, and I said, wait, what did you say? And she said, when we sat at the table with Joe and Kay, the mother-in-law and father-in-law, and told them that we were going to be moving back to Texas, the mother-in-law, Kay Petralia, said, would you mind if we shared a U-Haul with you? So they were planning on following Kristie and Jeff back to Texas. And I remember Kristie was really mad, and she said, if Kay thinks she's going to follow us back to Texas and she's going to be a full-time grandmother or our full-time babysitter to Zach, she's mistaken. He has another grandmother in Texas. So she was mad, thinking that the only reason they were coming back to Texas was because Jeff and Kristie and Zach were. So she was pretty irritated at that. So that was, you know, within the couple of months before her death that she told me that.
So I guess on one hand, you could maybe say, okay, it's grandparents that want to be closer to their grandchild or something along those lines. But from the gist of the conversation, it sounds like maybe Kristie thought they wanted to be in control and have a big say over everything.
Yes, that's how Kay was. Yes. Yeah, she thought Kay thought she could be a better mother to Zachary than Kristie could. And it was after her death that Jeff told me. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, myself and Kristie's mom, we didn't know until Jeff told me, and I told Kristie's mom. But I think Zach was 18 months old when Kristie was killed. So I think this was probably within maybe a few months or so after he was born, or he was drinking orange juice at the time. And apparently there was an argument over orange juice between Kristie and Kay, and they got in a physical fight. And Kay pulled Kristie's hair and knocked her down. And it was like the next day they were living with Joe and Kay at that time. So I guess they were pretty new in Florida. And so Kristie told me but Jeff said that like literally the next day they were looking for apartments to move in on their own. So I didn't know this until after Kristie had died. I had no idea.
So obviously that physical altercation was enough to let them know we've got to get out of here and get our own place because this isn't healthy. Okay. So let's go forward to March 31st, 1994. It's just after a 1-year anniversary of Kristie and Jeff getting married. Should have been a happy time, but instead, this tragedy strikes. Kristie was killed. Her in-laws, reported finding her bludgeoned and strangled in her home. I'm curious how and how fast did you find out about Kristie? What had happened to her?
I found out the next night. It was so odd. I was by myself at the time. My husband was at a concert, and it was 10:30 at night, and Barbara Skinner, Kristie's mom, calls me. And she's so funny because I've known her since I was 12, but yet when she called me, she said, "Hi, Emily, this is Barbara Skinner, Kristie's mom." And I remember at that split second, I'm thinking, why are you telling me that? I know who you are. I've known you for a long time. And I just said, okay, yeah, and then she said, I have some bad news. She goes, Kristie's dead. And my mind just frazzled. Like, anybody gets that kind of news, like your brain just freezes, like you just go in shock. And I said, wait, what? And she said, someone broke into Kristie's apartment and killed her. And then I just said, oh my God, I don't know how many times, because Barbara said, are you okay? And I said, no. And I just kept saying, oh my God, I couldn't believe it, because your mind races in a million places thinking, am I hearing things right? How did this happen? You start picturing things. And I remember telling her, I just talked to her exactly 2 weeks ago, like somehow that would make a difference. And yeah, that was it. It was so that was April 1st. I think I even asked Barbara, is this an April Fool's joke? Because Kristie was murdered on March 31st. So yeah, the next night it would have been April 1st. So I'll never forget it. I can still hear her voice, even when I think about it. But yeah, it was a pretty shocking night.
And how did her family cope with getting that news? It sounds like maybe her mom was sort of in shock a little bit when she was telling you this. How did they deal with it?
Barbara was, when I think about it, I think Kristie was very much like her mom. She was a very small woman herself. It's where Kristie got her, height and probably personality from. She was very strong. I don't remember seeing Barbara cry. She was just very stoic. I don't know how she did it. I don't know if it was a coping mechanism, but she was just very strong through the whole thing. I don't know how she did it, because now my daughter is 24. My daughter is named after Kristie, and my daughter is now 24. And I sometimes think back about how did Barbara get through this, because if something like that happened to my daughter, I don't know how I would go on every day. So yeah, I do. I think about Barbara and how she did it.
Yeah, not easy to do. And, I've talked to some people that say there's sort of a numbness. They don't really, they know what's happened, but they don't really, it hasn't hit them yet.
Yes.
So I wonder if some of that was going on. I'm curious, you had mentioned that earlier to me that Kristie didn't have any enemies. She was, not someone that would be the victim of violence. When you heard this news, did you start thinking, the wheels start turning, who would have done this or anything along those lines?
Yeah. Your brains just starts just going everywhere. Like, was the back door open? Who could have done it? Is there some, did someone try to break in? Kristie smoked, so sometimes she would go on the back patio. So you just start thinking all of that, but not one at first we didn't think Joe or Kay. We were just trying to think what the hell happened. Did someone break in through the back door? Because Kristie was a beautiful little woman, so we thought maybe she was hanging out in shorts or something, or whatever on the back patio, and some guy walked by or something, all those kind of things just go through your head.
Mm-hmm. And maybe she had drawn the attention of some dangerous person that broke into the apartment.
Yes.
Yeah. That's easy to think that. And a lot of times in a case like this, the first person that gets attention from the police is the husband of a murdered woman. And that's what happened in this case. Jeff seemed to go on police radar right away, but it turned out that he had a rock solid alibi, being at work, and there were witnesses at work that said he was there the entire time. So the police sort of shifted away from that, and that seems to be when they went to looking at Jeff's parents.
Yes.
What as far as what made them start looking at them and start of saying, hey, let's look at them as suspects?
I think what the Detective Westman, he was the first one on the case. He said when they refused to take a lie detector test. So I think that was what put their radar, because they did go down to the police station afterwards. The fact that the scene, you know, she wasn't raped. She had rings all over her dresser. She had real gold rings. Nothing was stolen. And when they came down to the, the station, that's what he said, that they refused to take a lie detector test. And I can't remember if it was one or two times they refused, but I do know that at one point Kay said, oh, our friends advised us to not do a lie detector test. And I remember thinking, you don't have any friends. Like, who could you be talking about? And so that's what started it.
Yeah, and I recall from the Unsolved Mysteries episode that they wound up doing about the case that their timeline was off too, compared to what a neighbor had said.
Yes.
So it definitely seemed like, their stories a little shifty, and then you have this history that comes to light of her not getting along, the physical altercation. So I could definitely see why they, how they shifted to them. And I guess eventually Jeff even began to suspect that his own parents were involved. Did he ever talk to you about that or discuss any of that with you?
He did. I mean, he definitely did suspect, but he said, if the cops didn't have any evidence, they were going to basically get away with it. That's basically what he said. Like, he kind of gave up. So yeah, it was strange.
It's got to be a tough situation for him, because here's his wife, the mother of his child, has been murdered, and he's thinking there's a real possibility his own parents are involved in this. You mentioned that they didn't cooperate with the lie detector test, that kind of stuff. How many times did police speak with them? Do you know how much they drilled down into them and tried to get their stories?
I think that's right at the beginning. That was it. That's all I was told, was that those, right after the murders. That was it. They never, that's what I couldn't understand. It's like, you see these TV shows where you see cops showing up and wanting to interview people after 20, 25 years, and the detectives just wouldn't go and talk to them. They just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't try to pressure them, nothing. So, and Detective Westman admitted to Barbara many years later that he admitted that they let the Petralias slip through their fingers like sand. So that was disheartening.
And that's hindsight is 2020, but to look back and say, okay, there's not a motive there. Robbery doesn't seem to be a motive. It doesn't seem like a sexual assault is a motive. So you start narrowing it down to really no motives, and you have to sort of come back to looking at something personal. And it seems like the only people that had something personal going on were her in-laws.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So over the years, the case, I imagine, went cold. As I mentioned, there was an Unsolved Mysteries episode that's pretty memorable. That sort of helped get attention for the case, but it didn't result in any kind of tips that solved the case, obviously, because the case is still officially unsolved now. And then Joe's father died Jeff's father, Joe, died in 2009, never being charged in the case. Is his mom, Kay, still alive?
From what I know, yes. I haven't heard anything. She should probably close to about 80, I'm assuming.
Wow. So as far as you know, have police spoken to them in any recent years, trying to just say, hey, Joe's gone now and you're up there in age. Is there anything you want to confess to? Has any of that happened? Do you know?
No, not the last time I talked to the detective. That was probably about 4 years ago. And as of then, nothing. He hasn't told me anything. So yeah, it's pretty stalled.
Has Jeff, did he ever confront them, just ask them point blank? Did you have anything to do with this, as far as you know?
Not that I know. He never said anything to me. But he cut off communicate. Well, I don't know about current relationship wise. I know that so many years ago we found out that Kay Petralia had sent Zach a birthday card at some point. So we were like, wait a minute, like, how did she get this address and stuff? But no, I mean, he cut off communication. The last I knew many years ago, like right after the murder, he cut off relationship with him, communication, because she was being kind of stalkerish, the mother-in-law.
Yeah. And that fits in sort of that pattern that you mentioned before of wanting to move to Texas to have some control over what happened in Zachary's life, maybe. But it sounds like in Jeff's mind, he pretty much seemed to conclude that they were responsible and sort of cut them off from what you're telling me.
Yeah, well, he cut them off because he found out they lied to him. This was probably about a year after the murder, and he had bought a house for him and Zach. And he was allowing Joe and Kay. Joe, by the way, is Jeff's stepfather. He wasn't his real father. I'm not sure what the relationship was between Jeff and his real father. I don't remember. But about a year after the murder, Joe and Kay did move back with Jeff. I mean, they actually, after Kristie's murder, they packed everything up in a U-Haul and drove down. I mean, all of a sudden memories are coming back. I remember something happened on the trip, and like Jeff kicked him out of the U-Haul. They had to I think they had to get a car or something and drive the rest of the way to Texas. She was like blaming him for doing drugs or something, and he kicked him out of the trip. And
Wow.
But somehow they kept in communication, and so him and Zachary were living in this house, and Joe and Kay were living with Kay's elderly mother in Waxahachie, Texas. And so every weekend they would come down and take Zachary for the weekend, and they allegedly would stay in a local hotel. And after one trip, Zachary, who was, I guess, 3 or so, he mentioned something about a flat tire. And so Jeff pressed him and found out that they were on their way to take Zachary to Waxahachie. And because of what Zachary said about a flat tire, and I guess then Jeff then called the hotel that they usually stayed at and found that they had never checked in. So I guess he found out that they had a flat tire on the way back to Waxahachie. So that was it for him. And then he cut off all communication with them. So he found out they lied. So who knows what they were trying to do with Zach? If they were trying to leave with him, I don't know. But they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And so because of what Zach said, he found out they had lied. They had tried to travel with him, and then that was it. So Jeff cut it off after that. And then that's when she became stalkerish. So yeah, there was one time a neighbor came to the door that lived, and Jeff was pretty new in the neighborhood. And this was some guy from like 2 or 3 houses down, said, "Hey, your mom just called me on my phone and was worried about her grandson and wanted me to come here and check on him." So this neighbor that had never met, Jeff, and she got the number of this neighbor down the street, and they actually came down and checked. And so that's what was happening at that time. That's just how she was acting. So yeah, she was very stalkerish. It was very bizarre.
Not a good pattern of her sort of getting her claws in and wanting to know what's going on and trying to insert herself.
Yes.
Now the unfortunate thing in all this is Zachary has grown up without probably remembering much of his mom at all.
Yeah.
I'm curious what's happened in his life and Jeff's life over the past 30 years. Where do things stand today with him?
Well, Zachary lived with Barbara, grandmother, and Pat, her husband, for many years. Jeff went to prison for about 6 years. This is, I think, when he was still living in that house. So from 95 to early 2001, Zachary was being raised by Pat and Barbara. And then Jeff got out of prison and I guess took Zachary back. But I think they didn't get along. And I think, he kept, I don't know, they're very much alike, Zachary and Jeff. And in 2004, Pat and Barbara moved to North Carolina. And I think Zachary stayed with them for quite a while. So there was always that separation between Jeff and Zach. And unfortunately, Zachary, I always hoped many, many years ago that when Zachary got bigger, he would start demanding answers, but he's the opposite. He's just like Jeff. He thinks nothing's ever going to happen, so just give it up. That's basically what Zachary's attitude has been. I haven't talked to Zachary in many years, but you know, every once in a while he'll leave a comment on her Facebook page, basically saying, "Don't even bother," which upsets me because Kristie, you know, he was everything to her, and it's sad that he doesn't have a memory of her. And so yeah, I didn't get that wish. I was really hoping that he was gonna kind of take over and start calling the detectives and saying, "Hey, do something about this," you know, demand answers from, you know, the grandmother, but nothing ever happened. So it's kind of like just a brick wall all the time with this, which is sad.
Sad, and it's sort of a ripple effect, you know, we talk about in a lot of the cases I cover, as far as when somebody is murdered like this, family, friends feel this, you know, thing that changes their lives and the outcome of their lives. And you know, now he's grown up without his mom in his life, and now he's at this point, it sounds like from what you're saying, he's given up and doesn't hold out any kind of hope that anything's going to happen. So what's the point, which is really, really sad to hear. But you know, one thing that it's out from the sounds of it, you haven't given up. You've been, you know, sort of keeping her case out there in the spotlight, talking about it, getting it on Facebook. Tell us a little bit about the Facebook page and your efforts to keep a light shine on the case.
Well, you know, I always think of Kristie. You know, I think, what if that were me? You know, like I've been heartbroken for many, many years since this happened, because you know, she was murdered, and then I just saw everybody just not doing anything. I mean, Barbara was a different story. Barbara and Pat were always with me. We were always calling detectives and you know, just always trying to keep it out there. But nobody else would. You know, her older sister kind of removed herself in a way from the whole case. I don't remember Carla being involved. Jeff just was the same way. And I would just kind of stand there and think, how can you do this to someone you love? You know, she was murdered at 20 years old. Like, how would you feel if you were murdered and nobody you loved did anything? Like, nobody demanded answers, because you would see on TV, people would say, I'm going to fight this until I die. I'm going to find out what happened to my loved one until I go to the grave. And yet I wasn't seeing that personally with these people that I've known for years. And I'm thinking, how do you let her down like this? You know, she deserves justice. She was only 20 years old. You know, she deserves, her life meant something. You know, she only got to be 20 years old on this planet. And so that's what I kept thinking. You know, it's like, if nobody's going to do it, then I'm going to do it. You know, I had the computer, and I learned how to make websites. And this was years ago, you know, in 1994. I mean, this was before anybody had the internet. So as soon as I had the internet, I started like putting things out there. I would go to true crime message boards and, you know, put her case up there. I mean, I was just trying to do whatever I could to keep her name out there. And then that's when the Facebook, I don't even remember how long ago I made the Facebook, but it was just always something that I could lead people to if they wanted to find out about the case, even though we pretty much know who did it, you know, and the chances of it getting solved are basically zilch, especially if Joe Petrolia is the one. He's dead now. So, but it's just, I just want to keep her name out there. You know, she deserves it. You know, she was a sweet person. She deserved to live a full life, you know, and she didn't get it. And so I just want to keep her name and her face out there. So, you know, everybody will know who she is.
Well, it's very admirable that you're doing it. And what is your Facebook page again?
It is facebook.com/justice for Kristie Lee.
Yeah, and I know you've got different articles and photos and things like that on there. So hopefully people listening, if they want to find out more about the case, they can go there. And as I mentioned, there's an Unsolved Mysteries episode on the case. People can go back and watch. It's one that I remember, you know, when I was young watching that episode. And here we are 30 years later talking about it with you. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking about Kristie's case and helping keep her memory alive. And I appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Thank you. Whatever it takes.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of The Murder of My Family. I'd like to thank Sonny Landon for writing and research assistance in this episode. We'll be back here soon with an all-new episode of The Murder of My Family, and I hope you'll join me for it. But before you go, remember that every murder victim means something to somebody.
You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, whenever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members only pay a $25 copay or less. No insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off of your first month when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Talkspace.com.